Hello, everybody, and welcome to another EFAy Q&A. Today, we'll be talking about the Welsh and Scottish elections, not regional elections, but national elections. And I have with me Jamie Grant, International Secretary from Young Scots from Independence, our youth wing from the SNP. And I have from Wales, I have our International Secretary, Lear Williams, and also Bureau Member and Secretary General for EFAy. So very happy to have you both, and thank you for coming.
Oh yeah, nice to have us.
Thank you very much.
So first of all, just to give the listeners and the viewers who are watching us a bit of a heads up of how is the situation in the UK after COVID and after Brexit. Scotland is currently, the independence polls are giving us quite good numbers, but we still need a majority. We're still very good numbers to ask for a second referendum. In Wales, plate is coming up very strong, is coming up very good in the polls, but we still didn't not that last push to get into government and give the people of Wales the government they deserve. Because it's been obvious that the Labour Party do nothing for the people of Wales. So maybe now to listen a bit more from our guests, maybe Jamie, I'm coming to you first. If you could explain us a bit of how the elections work in Scotland and how's a bit of the situation right now, and what's the different electoral system compared to the UK?
Sure. So I'll try and not put my history teacher hat on, but we're going back to 1603 and the Union of the Crowns. So essentially, if you can imagine in your head the Isles of Great Britain, Scotland is an independent nation, an independent kingdom, and our neighbours to the south are England, and then obviously we've got Wales and Ireland across the water. So in 1603, England and Scotland share a monarch. They have a shared king. And it's his project to try and merge the two nations into one to form the nation of Great Britain. And eventually, his predecessors are successful, and in 1707 there's the Acts of Union, which essentially merges the Scottish and the English parliaments to form the Parliament of Great Britain. Now, that sounds all fine and well. We're all fans of the EU. We love supranational parliaments. Except Scotland gets a rather raw deal out of this, and our national parliament is dissolved. And we get a paltry number of MPs that sit in the new British Parliament, which is actually in the English Parliament. So already Scotland, right off the bat, doesn't have a great deal. However, we did preserve our separate legal system, our separate education system, and our church. So these pillars of Scottish society managed to continue. And this is important to set the context of what follows, because in 1885, a Scottish office is sort of set up, and there's a dedicated member of the British government that is designated to look after Scottish affairs. And it's from this that the Scottish national identity politically stays alive. And fast forward almost 100 years later to 1999, there's a referendum in which Scotland majority, 70 plus, vote for a devolved parliament. So for the first time in 300 years, Scotland gets its parliament back. Now, the UK parliament retains power over foreign relations, defence, monetary affairs, the energy, large aspects of taxation and welfare, and the constitution. But everything else is pushed to the Scottish Parliament, and that's called the devolved Parliament. So that's what we have at the moment. So the parliamentary system that Scotland uses is the additional members system. There's two types of MSPs. There's constituency MSPs, members of the Scottish Parliament, and there's list MSPs. The constituency MSPs represent specific areas in Scotland. So here in Stirling is our candidate Evelyn Tweed, and she's running, I got props, she's running for the Stirling constituency. And that race is just straight up, first past the post, the person with the most votes win. The second group of MSPs are elected on the regional list. Scotland's broken up into 8 parliamentary regions. So Stirling, the city that I'm in at the moment, and the area, is part of the Mid-Scotland and Fife region for the Scottish Parliament. And that region returns 7 MSPs. Now, they're elected through a proportional system, the Haunt, is the mechanism that's used. And so a party that does particularly well on the first vote, the constituency vote, will require more list votes to win list seats. And that way there's a sort of weighting element to make sure people get representation. And as a constituent, it's really good because if your constituency MSP is someone you don't like or a party you don't like, you've still got all these other ones that still represent you. Now, that's the way that the system works in Scotland at the moment. And I guess I'll talk a little bit later about how the SNP sort of broke that system and how we're hoping to do it again.
Well, thank you very much, Jamie, for that explanation. And now I'll go to Lear as well, because we're dying to hear about Wales.
Yeah, there's similarities and differences. Scotland and England were joined together in an act of union. We were never asked. It was assumed. We just, so maybe we can leave without asking. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how this works.
You will never ask in and leave without permission as well.
Yeah. So our elections work somewhat similar to that in Scotland, but there's a lot less members of the Welsh Parliament, or Senedd Cymru as it's known. So there's 60 members of the Senedd, elected 40 of them by first past the post. And then we have 5 regions electing 4 members of the Senedd each. So it's a very similar system to that in Scotland. Wales also voted in 1999 to establish what was then called the Welsh Assembly, or Cynulliad Cymru in Welsh, and then it has limited powers. Wales's devolution settlement is third rate in the United Kingdom. It is worse than that of Scotland and worse than that of the north of Ireland as well. So we don't have our own police force. That means that this Thursday, we are also electing police and crime commissioners. They are politicians who lead kind of the link between police forces and the public. So Plaid Cymru currently has 2, there's 4 to be elected. So where in Scotland there's 2 elections on 2 different voting systems, we have 3 on 3 different voting systems. Because we don't have powers over our own police, we don't have much of our own legal system at the moment, and we don't have the level of taxation powers that Scotland has. And it's the same with regards to Northern Ireland as well. So Wales is really under this third-rate devolution system, and it creates a lot of problems for us as a country. We have quite a high percentage, something like, my numbers may be wrong here, but we have something like 6-7% of the railway funding, but of the railways, but we receive far less than that in funding. So it creates specific issues, this devolution settlement that we had. Wales voted to strengthen the powers of the Assembly, as it was known back then, in a referendum in 2011. And since then, the Senedd now has tax-raising powers, and it's changed its name to go from being an Assembly, Cynulliad Cymru, to now being known as Senedd Cymru, the Welsh Parliament.
Well, thank you very much, Lear. I think now I'm going to ask you about the particular situation specifically in your parties. I think COVID has been a great example of how a party was before, and then for Nicola Sturgeon, she has come more reassured. It's been good, but I think for Plaid has been a particularly good example of the importance of the Welsh institutions and how good, how good the evolution has been for Plaid and for a leader like Adam Price that has been there. So I think now, Lear, I'll come to you first. What was the state of Plaid before coming up to this election?
You're spot on there. The pandemic has given a greater platform for Welsh institutions. One area of policy making where we don't have powers as well is broadcasting. Plaid Cymru has been campaigning for the devolution of broadcasting for years and years, and the Labour Party, even though they benefited from the eyes being on Welsh institutions throughout the pandemic, are still dithering, still not really strong on their message on the need to devolve broadcasting. Health has devolved to the Welsh Parliament. So it's been the Welsh First Minister which has set the restrictions for Wales. And at times they have differed to that in England. And what Plaid has done is put forward its own platform, its own ideas. And we've been seen as the alternative. It's been good for the Labour Party in Wales. They've had this recognition. They've been able to put measures in place to protect the Welsh public, to ensure a successful vaccine programme as is happening now. But we've been there working with the Welsh Government and, campaigning for better measures for businesses, better measures for the self-employed and for others. So what we could have done is been like the Conservative Party, because what the Conservative Party has done in Wales throughout the whole pandemic is ignore the needs of the Welsh people, ignore the specific challenges within certain areas in Wales, and has said to the Welsh Parliament that they should do everything that is said in London for what the restrictions should be in England. The gyms close in Wales during the 2-week lockdown that we had before Christmas. The Welsh Conservatives campaigned for gyms to open. They shut in England for a month afterwards and they all go silent. Before Christmas, when we had problems with a new variant which is spreading throughout the country, the Welsh Conservatives were calling for a release of restrictions in the whole of the north of Wales before Christmas because case numbers were falling. And that really changed very quickly. So we've been a sensible opposition, constructively working to protect public health, but also calling for more support, calling for more actions. And going into this election, I think the Welsh public have more of an awareness as to what the Welsh Government does, where it legislates, where it cannot legislate. And Mark Drakeford, the Welsh First Minister, who because most of our media, especially in the English language, comes from the UK-wide newspapers and the UK-wide media organisations. He wasn't that well known. Now, as he's been on people's televisions giving the coronavirus briefings, now people know who he is. So we're going to these elections with a more informed Welsh public, which is far better and far healthier for our democracy.
Yes, I always say, the Tories always try to harm education so they can keep lying to the public. So now, Jamie, coming from the same, I think Nicola and independence polls have been given all these good numbers in such a race because of the strong leadership throughout this pandemic and throughout these difficult times. So what do you think is the current state of the SNP coming to these elections?
Well, I mean, much as Lear said, I think, ironically, if anything, the pandemic has been more of an educational exercise for the English electorate and Westminster politicians on what devolution actually is. I think there was a news report from last year, and I think it was Michael Gove, who's one of the UK government ministers, had to give a presentation on the importance of Scotland, the importance of the devolution settlement. And the Treasurer, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, left that meeting like, right, I now understand why this is also important. So that's the sort of level of understanding that we have. And if anything, the pandemic has left the UK leader, Boris Johnson, a diminished man. Not only did he catch COVID and he luckily survived it, but many people in England now realise in many matters of state, he is an English Prime Minister opposed to the Prime Minister of the country, especially for health. So it really changed, I think, the public understanding of what the United Kingdom is. Many people saw it as a monolithic country, but now it's seen as a union of 4 nations. And certainly in Scotland and in Wales and Northern Ireland, that has been the understanding for many years. But now it's really driven that home that actually these are 4 different countries that are living under a system that's creaking at the seams. And the pandemic's exposed that big time. Nicola Sturgeon has absolutely led from the front for this. She's gave, over the last year, I think 200 odd press briefings. She's taken the hit for mistakes that have been made and errors in judgment, but she's been there and she's been accountable. And the same can't really be said for Boris Johnson. Something that's illustrative, my grandmother, who dyed-in-the-wool Labour supporter, trade unionist all of her days, she voted SNP in this election, by and large, because of Nicola's leadership. And touching on Lear's point about media, certainly there's a unionist slant and lens that people see, especially in Scotland, of the SNP and the Scottish Government. But this pandemic has provided the crystallisation of the different approach Scotland takes, and they've heard it straight from the horse's mouth. They've heard it from our First Minister on a platform, what she's doing, her rebuttals, and also the silly questions that can sometimes be asked by journalists, and that's made a huge difference in cutting through the narrative. But I mean, to give you some context, I mean, the SNP have been in government since 2007 in Scotland, so it's 14 years, and we're still riding high in the opinion polls, some 50% over in the constituency vote, which is just unheard of in modern Western democracy. But the big challenge for us in this election is there's been multiple events, Brexit for one, that's shown the democratic deficit. The SNP's big challenge in this election is to weave a coherent narrative about why independence is necessary for recovery from the pandemic, because no one in their right mind thinks that an independence referendum will be held next week or in a year's time. But certainly the story we're trying to tell is, if we want a strong recovery from the pandemic, then Scotland needs those powers over the economy, over energy, taxation, social security. What do we recover to is the big question in this election. And all the parties have made recovery a plank of their offer, but it's the pro-independence parties that are actually ambitious. They're saying, look over the water, there's Denmark, Norway, Finland. They're some of the happiest, wealthiest countries in the world. Why not Scotland? So that's the frame of the election at the moment. Is independence vital to recovery or not?
Yeah, I think you gave it on spot. Is what country do the people of Scotland decide to recover to, and how do they decide to make that recovery themselves, not decided by? Because I remember Nicola Sturgeon wanting to extend the furlough scheme, and it was up to Westminster to extend it. And I think it's when you have the full powers in your hands, then you are able to run the country in the way people maybe think should be, but it's democracy. So
you're spot on.
And now, for the next question, I don't promote gambling, and I'm not promoting you take a bet. Sorry, Lee, you wanted to make a comment?
Yeah, just before we in Wales, we've had just to add on to the points about independence as the best recovery plan. We had our own problems with the UK government in Wales, where we had to have a firebreak lockdown in Wales for 2 weeks in October. The UK government made this massive political point, just saying, no, we won't give you the help to support working people with furlough payments, until England went into their own lockdown a couple of weeks later, and then the money came. And that was a moment of awakening for Welsh people, that unless we have the powers over our own, unless we can decide our own destiny, the UK government, Westminster will never act in our benefit. And that was a real breaking point. And we've seen in Wales support for independence growing and growing and growing, especially through the pandemic. The non-political group Yes Cymru, which is a pro-independence group, has grown to over 20,000 members. Plaid Cymru is seeing members come to it from all over the political spectrum, especially from former Labour voters who want independence as part of the recovery plan, who've seen what can be done to protect Welsh people, to protect Welsh businesses when Welsh people are in control, when the Welsh institutions are in control. And we've had a few breaking points during this pandemic, and that was one of them, where we weren't allowed to decide our own thing. And then when the situation changed in Westminster, then we had the permission. So we've had very much the same, and that is why independence is such a core issue in our election this time round as well.
Yeah, I think it goes back to when Jamie was explaining the union between England and Scotland, and those centuries back. It's not a union of equals right now for Wales, for Scotland, for nobody. It's just a forced contract, because it's literally what England wants, England does, and then the rest we are forced to follow. And it's not anymore our parliament where we're not able to legislate for our people. But well, now following to the next question, and you don't have to take a bet on this, but what are your expectations, or where are you calculating are going to be the results of this upcoming election? Come on, be bold.
Lear, do you want to go first?
You can go first.
Damn it. So again, to set the sort of historical backdrop, the SNP won the election in 2007, and I say won, they got one more seat more than their nearest rival, the Labour Party, and so it gave them the sort of moral victory to form a minority government, and they somehow managed to keep going for the next 4 years, and in 2011 they won an outright majority. I think it was 6, which is just unheard of in this proportional system. It's very hard to do. So they won the 2011 election. That set the path forward for the Edinburgh Agreement of 2012. So the UK and the Scottish governments agreed a path to a referendum. They made sure that all the legal stuff was bottomed out. And we had a referendum in 2014 and sadly lost, 45 to 55. And then in 2016, the SNP stood on a manifesto platform and said, if there is a material change in circumstances, i.e., the Scotland being dragged out of the EU against our will, so Scotland votes to stay in the EU, but the UK votes to leave, and Scotland has to be dragged out. That is a material change that should trigger another independence referendum. And then a few months later, that come to pass. However, in 2016, the SNP lost its majority. Now, remember, it's very unlikely to get a majority, but they lost it nonetheless. And in the British context, majorities are everything. I mean, we elect 5-year dictatorships in Westminster, frankly. If a party has a majority, it can do what it wants. So the SNP lost their majority in 2016, but there was still a pro-independence majority with the Greens. However, the request for a referendum was denied. Now is not the time, is what Theresa May, the Prime Minister, said. And so for this upcoming election, the goalposts for the SNP are to regain that majority. The polls suggest it's possible. The most recent poll today suggests we could see a majority of around about 7, but just 2 weeks ago it was putting us 1 short of a majority. So, I mean, we have sort of fallen into the UK government's framing, but I would really hope for an SNP majority government because that's the path that's worked before. Morally, however, if there's a pro-independence majority, we should be seeing a referendum. So if I was a betting man, which I am known to have the occasional scratch card, I would say that it's hopefully going to be an SNP majority and the Greens in double digits, because that would be fantastic to see. I've got a lot of time for the Greens.
Yes, I personally, now before I go to Lear, because I'm to the Scottish elections quite into as well, I do think the Greens are going to do better double numbers in these elections. And I really hope, we're kind of close of getting that big majority. I think, 60, I'm not going to say numbers, but 63, 64, with the... But well, Lear, I come now to you. I'm sorry I don't dare to bet on the Welsh elections. No. I don't have enough information, but what are your numbers? What are you telling me?
What are our numbers? I'm expecting a Plaid Cymru victory, of course, because our message is simple in this election. If you want to vote for Wales, as it says on my jumper, it's a vote for Plaid Cymru. The previous Senedd, the Labour Party, have been very strong in Wales. They've led the Welsh government since 1999. Ever since it was formed, they've been the dominant party in Wales for, is it over 100 years, or at least 100 years by now? So Wales is crying out for change once again at these elections, especially after 20 years now, more than that, sorry, 21 years of the Labour Party in government in Wales. So at the last election, Labour won 29 seats, falling short of an overall majority. With our electoral systems, both in Scotland and in Wales, it's very difficult for one party to win a majority, because the more seats they win, more constituencies they win first past the post, the less they can win on the list. So what the opposition parties usually do in these elections is swap regional seats for constituencies and constituency seats for regional seats. So it's quite difficult for parties to advance. But this time, I'm hoping that things are different. The polls are showing that the Labour Party is weaker than they've been previously. The Conservative Party is emboldened under Boris Johnson, but also the party to watch in these elections, and I'm not biased at all, is Plaid Cymru, because it's Adam Price, our leader, who's cut through in the election debates. It's our message that has cut through on the doorstep when we were eventually allowed to speak with the electorate. And also, for the first time ever, 16 and 17-year-olds will be able to vote in Welsh elections. And young people in Wales are the independence generation. So we are hoping to see Plaid Cymru receive a lot of support from the independence generation, from young people who've lived under a Welsh Parliament and want to see Wales have far much more of a say in what it does. So I'm hoping for a Plaid Cymru majority. If we fall short of that, I'm hoping to see Plaid Cymru really getting close to the Labour Party and increasing its vote share I won't go into numbers, but because we don't know, we haven't been able to campaign in the traditional way, and the polls in Wales are all over the place at the moment, depending on who they ask and where they ask, and the numbers are so wildly different. One aspect to the Welsh Parliament, which didn't happen in Scotland, is that in 2016, 7 members of the far right were elected on the back of support for the EU referendum. The EU referendum, the Brexit referendum, took place was 6 to 8 weeks after the last Welsh Parliament elections. So the UKIP party, led by Nigel Farage, gained 7 seats throughout the last December Senedd term. They have achieved nothing. They have done nothing. One UKIP member suggested that maybe Wales can ask Ireland for support for our motorway because Ireland can access EU funds. So they didn't know what their core message was. And now we've seen this big fracture of that group into different parties, people trying their best to keep on to their jobs. It's not about the people when you're the far right, is it? It's about yourselves and your interests. So we've seen a lot of these parties pop up now who are against Wales, against our language, who want to abolish this, abolish that, abolish the Welsh language. And we are hoping, the polls are here nor there, but we are hoping that after these elections, we can have a Welsh Parliament, a Senedd Cymru, free from the far right once again. And that will make me very proud of my country if we can get rid of these people from our Parliament, because they do not belong there and they do not deserve to be at the heart of Welsh democracy.
I think, yeah, you make a very good point. This fascism is a crippling disease across Europe, and it's getting into our parliaments way more than we liked. And in the last event that we covered, the Catalan elections, we could see it, and in the Spanish ones as well. It's just very scary to see this, that people don't learn. But you made a very good point that now for the Welsh elections, it will be the first time for 16 and 17-year-old to vote. Now, going back to, do you think the youth that you said tend to be more pro-independence, they tend to be more revolutionary? I'm asking you this both. Do you think your parties are the party of the youth? Do you think the majority of young people will be voting for your parties? And if so, why? I'm going to go to Jamie first.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because, again, I don't want to delve too much into history, but for the benefit of your viewers, so after the Second World War, 1945, there emerged a kind of social economic consensus in the UK, the post-war settlement. So the right-wing party, the Conservatives, and the left-wing party, Labour, they broadly agreed that the goals of society and government should be, to promote industry, to build council houses, strong trade unionism, a decent standard of life and wages. I mean, that was a kind of standard agreement. But then that fractured in the 70s and 80s when the UK economy underwent tremendous economic change. And Margaret Thatcher, who's probably someone that people are familiar with, ushered in huge neoliberal free market reforms that accelerated these trends. And I'm from an area in Scotland that was famous for coal mining. And over the course of 10 years, most coal mining pits closed. Now, I don't blame her for that. I blame her for accelerating the trends and leaving people with nothing. You're talking whole towns just made unemployed over the course of a few years. And whereas in other countries, such as Germany, the Ruhr region, I visited there, even back then in the 70s and 80s, when these same economic trends were continuing, there was educational programs, there was vocational programs. People weren't left with this hopelessness. And so that generation that remember the post-war era, that they're perhaps in their 60s and up, they're the generation in Scotland that are so pro-union and against independence because they have this nostalgic memory of what the UK is to them. The UK is the state that delivered toilets in their house and jobs for their family and brought their families out of poverty. Whereas for everyone below that, and you can see this in the polling evidence, they can sort of see the UK for what it is. They can see that actually it's an independent Scotland that wants to return to that social democratic consensus. And young people especially, I mean, the 24 below demographic 70% plus support independence. So this union is on life support. I think from 24 and below it's 70%, from 24 to I think 36, independent support is about 55%, and even so basically all the way up to 60-year-olds, it is in the majority of people wanting independence. It's this last grey block holding on to this notion of a different UK. So the trend is clear to me that independence appears to be inevitable. You don't want to jinx it, but it appears to be inevitable because that's how people see a good life for themselves and their families. That's how they see this social democratic Nordic type model that they want. And unfortunately, a large swathe of the English voting Tory electorate are not keen for it, and that's sort of holding the UK back. So that's a very long, rambling answer to say that independence is just, I think in my lifetime, I think it's going to happen.
No, but I think you made a very good point. We're the generation that has inherited so many economical crises that we have seen our parents losing their job, our grandparents, being left with hardly any pensions, and we're fed up with it. We're like, no, I don't want to be 40, 50 years and have to go through this. So I think, it's true. We have inherited this, economical crisis and crisis in general, because it's been obviously not just economical, that I think for generations have made us awaken and be like, it's going to be our future. We better make something before, we can't decide and it's too late. And
Exactly.
and I go back to Lear. I think you were mentioning roughly before how young people now in Wales are waking up and seeing that change. What do you think?
I think amongst it's the 16 to 24-year-olds, I think, that are the independence generation. When doing the independence marches we had before the pandemic in Wales, there was a massive presence of young people there because they've lived for the most of their lives now, that age bracket, under a Welsh Parliament, and they've seen what a Welsh education system made in Wales for Wales has achieved, what the Welsh Health Service, even though it can be managed far better by a new Welsh government, what can be achieved. And going into these elections, I think that I hope especially that young people are going to turn out in huge numbers to vote for Plaid Cymru, because Plaid Cymru is the party that listens to them. And as a young member of Plaid Cymru, I've always felt that young voices are listened to in Plaid, that we have an influence over policy decisions. So that's why Plaid is promising, has listened to what young people are saying and are promising guaranteed employment for 18 to 24-year-olds. Why? Because young people have been hit hardest by the pandemic. It's young people that are hit by the housing crisis, especially the second home crisis that we have in Wales. And there's Plaid Cymru that support the campaigns like Hawli Fyw Adre, the right to live at home, where so many young people are being forced out of rural communities by second homes, by holiday homes, and by the total lack of affordable housing. So it's Plaid Cymru have built up a policy platform by listening to the very voters who are the independence generation and tailoring their policies for these people. We don't want to see a Wales where services are dragged from west to east, as happened for years and years and years under the Westminster system, and is now happening under the Welsh government as well. So it's Plaid that are really putting forward a model that anybody can live anywhere in Wales. There needs to be high quality employment and high quality education in every part of Wales. And that's from listening, from speaking to young people. So I think Plaid will do very well amongst young people because the party has listened to them. I had a leaflet through from the Labour Party, which said all the things that Labour has done for you. And I sat there and I thought, well, growing up in West Wales, I certainly could feel a lot of services moving that way. So it's not that true, is it? So yeah, just to summarise on my point a little, the support for independence comes from this consciousness among the young people that when rules and laws are made in Wales by the Welsh government, they are better suited for Wales and Welsh communities. So they will support that.
Yeah, completely. I think, and with housing and stuff, you made a very good point, and it's something we need to really push on our parties, because I think for us, like I'm 22, and the idea of buying a house seems so foreign, seems so impossible, that it doesn't feel like housing is anything that could apply to me. But it goes back to, like, I think we have to push for our parties to create sustainable housing, to fight against these giants like Airbnb and businesses like that are selling houses for leisure instead of for living, and creating opportunities for young people in their hometowns, and like stop forcing people to move to the cities, stop forcing young people to move to London if they want to succeed in any artistic career or in any other business. Bring those opportunities to your country and put them everywhere across, so you don't feel the exit of young people. But sorry, I had to make that point. And now, just as a wee question, talking about, mentioning for me, one of these issues that is housing and the lack of opportunities in certain places. What do you think are the main issues coming up to these elections? And I'll go to Leah first, please.
So, of course, it goes without saying, recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic, how a Welsh recovery looks like. There's specific issues which has affected Wales, where houses in rural areas in Western Wales are being sold at insane levels. People who live in houses are receiving letters from estate agents encouraging them to sell, because there are that many people that want to buy houses, and that is pushing up the property prices at a time when young people have been affected almost the worst economically by the pandemic, because they were the ones who had jobs in retail or jobs in hospitality, for example, which were either lost or, from shops closing and things like that. Also, then the health service. I think the pandemic has given everybody a greater appreciation of just what a publicly funded health service can do for people. And over the years, especially in rural Wales, there's been this removal of services from Wales, from rural Wales, and I think that made communities feel more vulnerable through this pandemic. So we need to reevaluate where services are based, how they operate in rural Wales as well in urban Wales. And then for the first time, independence is a key issue. It's a key debate going into these elections. When you've got unionists saying all sorts of things about independence being, a bad idea in the literature, that you've made it a key argument. And also, education. There's a new curriculum being set up in Wales, but once again, we're seeing this lack of decent education on Welsh history, on Welsh LGBT history, on specific things which are the building blocks of the history of our nation. And then also jobs and education in rural Wales. How can remote working be used to boost the economy in places that are seeing the brain drain, that are losing their young people? And they're the main issues, and it's fantastic to see independence and this talk of who we want to be and who we are as a nation being one of the core points of parties' election campaigns. It's a really encouraging thing, because it's already happened in Scotland, and they're having that debate, and we have seen it on and off in Wales, but now it's one of these cornerstones of parties' election campaigns.
I think as a former waitress, I think the young people have definitely been hit the most by not being able to work face to face. But I think you made a very good point. It's funny that independence now. Well, it's not funny. It's great that independence is the main argument, because really, all the main issues that people are raising to us when we're campaigning or stuff, they're all answered by independence. The solution to all the lack of funding, all the lack of housing is the devolved powers, and that's through independence. And I think, well, Jamie, you might have to add more to this. What do you think are the main issues for these elections?
I mean, it's a mixed bag, and obviously I'm coming at this from a pro-independence SNP member perspective. I think on the offset, I would say I'm actually quite disappointed by the opposition, by the unionist opposition, about their lack of imagination, because we all sort of remember the start of the pandemic, and March and April was a very scary time, and then as things began to sort of ease in the summer, these big, huge conversations were opening up about, well, okay, what are we going to go back to? Are we thinking 4-day week? Are we thinking UBI? Are we thinking, all these transformational changes? People were pointing, to what happened after World War II, the creation of the welfare state, the NHS. Is this our generation's moment? And I just feel like the debate in Scotland has been very stale in places. It's been very technical and focused on a referendum. And so I saw this really interesting piece of media research. It broke down what all the major party leaders had been talking about, their main messaging, keywords on social media. The ones that mentioned independence and referendum the most were the Conservative Unionist opposition and the Liberal Democrat opposition. It's just they're focusing on this technicality or the technical process of opposing a referendum because it works on the doorsteps. People don't want a referendum straight away. Whereas I think the conversation should be, what country are we rebuilding? What is the point of the recovery? What are we going to recover to? And the SNP and the Greens are making that positive vision. So certainly on the doorsteps, or I say on the doorsteps, I've hardly ever canvassed because we've been limited. But in conversation with families, economic recovery is front and centre. Businesses have been hit really badly in Stirling by the lack of tourism, by the lack of traffic, and just by virtue of being closed. But also opportunities for young people. Loads of people, middle-aged people with kids and young people are worried the long-term damage this might do to their children's future. Education's been disrupted. University courses have been blown off course as well. So, they've written down some notes about policy. The SNP have introduced a 16 to 24-year-old youth guarantee. So that is a promise of a job, an apprenticeship, further or higher education place for young people to get them back on track and to give them, something to be getting on with, so they're not sort of left on the scrap heap like previous generations. Under 22 bus travel is going to be made free in Scotland as well. So that will help our rural communities and keep young people rooted where they've grown up, but they need to maybe look further afield for economic opportunity. And also, tuition's still free in Scotland. So trying to reduce economic barriers to education to get people upskilled and participate in this new economy. But circling back to my main point, it's just the lack of imagination from the unionist opposition. It's so infuriating. This is the big accelerator for the fourth industrial revolution. We're talking automation, we're talking renewable energy, all these huge big societal concepts, and yet the leaflets keep saying referendum, deny the referendum, block the referendum. And it's like, would you just shut up about a referendum? I'm a pro, I want an independence referendum, and you talk about it more than me. What is your idea for education in this post-pandemic environment? What's your thoughts on blended learning? How does that implicate childcare if kids are at home and their parents are working? Do we need a national child service? How does that look with transport systems and energy and homes? These huge ideas are not being spoken about by parties that claim to represent half the country, and that to me is the biggest missed opportunity.
Well, I think, on my behalf, I'm glad, they haven't knocked that tree, making it easier for us. But it is true, because I remember one of the things that, seeing it from the outside, one of the things that amazed me the more about the 2014 referendum was the unionist campaign, even though it was, now we know, based on lies and it was all false, but they made a very strong campaign when they ended up winning. And for me, it was like, good, they recognize there's a problem of identity, and there's a problem that needs to be spoken, that they haven't given enough time to Scotland, and now I feel like they've given up. Like in 2014, seeing it from outside, I was like, nice that you're recognizing the issue, and now I'm just like seeing, okay, there's a problem, I'm not going to do anything to fix it, I just have to keep protesting, looking like I'm doing something. Just keep busy, look busy.
You're totally right, and it's the accumulation of many factors. Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister's leadership, just to me, he's a caricature and the distillation of everything that's wrong with the United Kingdom. Privilege, elitism, a lack of talent, a bumbling idiot in a time that we needed an actual leader. I mean, the guy, and not to get off piece, the guy thinks he's Churchill reincarnate. This was his Churchill moment. This was his moment to lead us from the darkness and lead the country to victory. And what does he do? He goes shaking hands in a pandemic and bragging about it and catches COVID. Like, it boggles the mind. But I mean, all better for us, because it encapsulates, just like Brexit, why we want out of this union, because
Exactly.
people like that are running the show.
Exactly. And now that you mentioned talking about who's leading and what's the role to victory and who's leading that, what do you think is the role of YSI? And I'll come later on to you, Lear. What do you think is the role of YSI and played in these upcoming elections? What do you think it's important, that we're involved, and what do we have to say?
I mean, the SNP is very lucky in that we have a wide variety of talent. We're a big tent party, so we're a party that speaks for trade unions and businesses and students and landlords and any and all sections of society. We try and represent interests, and it's a difficult balancing act, but it means that we can draw on talent from all different places. So we have actually quite a few ministers in government, in the Scottish government, that are quite young comparatively to other countries. So the role of the YSI, first and foremost, is to engage in our party's young members, offer them opportunities and training and networking, so they're ready to be the next generation of politician. But also we can act as a bit of a research unit to make sure the party's messages remain relatable. What are young people caring about? What do our classmates, our university mates, our friends care about, and feed that into policy making. So the role that the YSI's played in this election, because it has mostly been digital, we've been able to put our digital skills to the test. And I'm communications officer for my region, so I've worked with the team of other communications officers to make sure our messaging's on point. We're making graphics and videos, but also all the campaigns across the country, and I'm very pleased at this, they've recognised the importance of that young vote. 16-year-olds can vote in this election. So the campaigns know that they need young people involved to target young people and young votes. It's things worth grabbing. So that, to me, is the YSI's role: engaging young people and working with campaigns to make sure they're relevant to young people. And I feel like we've actually done a good job of it.
Well, as a YSI member, I think we have done a good job of it as well. Now, as a Plaid ally, what's the role of Plaid in this election? Why do you think it's so important that you are there?
Plaid Ifanc, just as Jamie said, 16 to 18-year-olds can vote in this election for the first time. So it's been Plaid Ifanc's job, really, to market Plaid Cymru's policies towards young people on platforms that they understand, be that TikTok, be that Instagram, and also to really raise the just what young people in education and young people in employment have had to go through. The disruption to their education, disruption to their employment throughout this pandemic, and really raise also the plight of young people faced with the second homes crisis. And Plaid Ifanc has really stepped up in that sense to do this. Also, there are Plaid Ifanc candidates, some fantastic Plaid Ifanc candidates, really fighting hard in key constituencies and key seats, and also who are in campaigning teams, making sure that young people are there campaigning on the ground, speaking to others. So as these elections have gone on, we're online. I don't know what it was in Scotland, but in Wales, election campaigning couldn't really happen till towards the end of March. And I'm sure Jamie knows, just like me, usually we're starting knocking doors a year and a half, maybe 2 years beforehand. There's multiple strategies. There's so many things to get involved in. So this campaign was really turned on its head about what we could do to get the message out. And that's where young people have stepped up on social media to help candidates, to help different campaigning teams as well, to get their message to all ages on social media, but also to really target this crucial voting bloc of the independence generation, the young people. And also to make memes. We've got some amazing people. Amazing people in Welsh independence social media that just make hilarious memes and just make amazing memes. And the Welsh Conservatives are just so memeable. I mean, it's been brilliant.
Douglas Ross, the leader from the Scottish Conservatives, is a whole meme as well. Like,
You just can't,
I
Colin.
think
You
it's a
just can't.
casting for to enter in the Conservatives. You have to be just looking funny or something. It's the only way to attract people. But I think, more like to speak to the rest of our youth organizations that are watching us and stuff. I think Jamie and Lear made a very good point, and if we engage with all young people across our country, either via classmates, either via friends in the gym or whatever, we have connections. Young people have a network of contacts all across the country, and for us, that's what we have to use. We have to use those tools to create a legacy for our party to keep growing, and to create a pool of talent and form our members, to make sure our ideas, our dream is not dying when we are moving on. And I think it's something that all our organizations across EFAy, we have to use that power of networking when we're young, and make sure, that when we move on, when we're going to be 30, 35, that we're not going to be considered young anymore, that we have a good team to fill our shoes.
I said this at an event, and when it was put on social media, it caused a bit of controversy. But I don't believe the young people should have a say. We should have the say, because our voice has been lost from politics for so long. Why isn't social media regulated? Sorry. Why aren't these anonymous social media platforms, which cause immense damage to people, why aren't they regulated? Because there aren't young people in governments, and that's what we need. And we need young people at the heart of decision making in political parties, in governments, just so that we can basically forward what matters to us. Housing matters to us, employment matters to us, skills matter to us. And with all this new technology, especially, we need specific policies to protect young people. So instead of having a say, as is constantly said to young people, we should have the say. We should lead the discourse, because our voices matter just as much as anybody else. And our voices are so lost in politics. And it's amazing seeing, I've had the pleasure since being Secretary General of EFAy to see young people across the continent stand up and demand change. Excellent candidates in Wales, in Scotland, in Germany, and in the Spanish state and the French state. Excellent young candidates standing up for what they believe in, demanding a say. And that's what our roles are as youth organisations, I think. So what's been great in this election campaign in Wales is that the young voice is being heard, policy being made to help young people. So it is about having the say, I think. Sorry, I got a bit passionate there.
To go off the back of what you're saying, Lear, as well, I think people have to realise that politicians and politics is a selfish game, and that if you don't make yourself an attractive voting bloc, they're not going to care what you think. The reason that a lot of society and the economy is geared seemingly into the interests of the older generations is because they actually vote. They turn out, they reliably vote, and politicians know they need to court those votes if they want to get back in their jobs. So, I understand that there's apathy, but it's up to young people to break through that apathy, get involved with organisations like ours across Europe and the world, because that's the only way that things are really going to change.
Yeah, I think, and it's important to remember is our future. We're inheriting every policy they make, every decision they are making now. It's going to have a repercussion in our future. That's why it's so important that we're on it. And the older generations are making us to be these lazy millennials, Gen Z, that are all day in social media doing nothing. When in reality, what I see is we're a generation of people that are very aware of other people's phobias, or are very aware of other people's mental health. We're very understanding, we're very empathetic. Let's bring that to our parliament, because it's missing. But I think to our last question, because I think we've done a good hour today. So, and I'm enjoying a lot. So we could be here all the time. But as a last question to finish, what do you think? After the results of these elections, what do you think are the next steps for your party, or what do you think comes after these elections? I'll go to Lear first, and then to you, Jamie.
So the next steps after the results as they come in, we will see. As I said, with our election system, it's very difficult for one party to get a majority, and the polls aren't really giving us a clear indication of what will happen. I'd like to think, and it's certainly what the polls saying are very different to what Plaid members are hearing on the ground, is that we'll see a swell of support for Plaid Cymru. And then we have hopefully a discussion on our future as a nation. It's in Plaid Cymru's manifesto for an independence referendum within 5 years if we lead the Welsh Government. So this is what we need. This is a part of our recovery plan, to have the say over what we do as a nation. And also what I hope happens is that we don't see those who want to abolish Wales, who want to roll back the rights of our language, who want to breed hate and division, such as the far right. I don't want them anywhere near our parliament. So that's what I'm hoping for. What do I expect after? We need a discussion on serious issues which are currently being ignored by the Welsh Government. Even though they're run by the centre-left Labour Party, they're ignoring the voices of people who are struggling to get in on the housing ladder. They're ignoring the voices of people who are demanding that Wales can't just be an urban country. There's one region, the Mid and West, which elects 4 MPs, that covers something like 2/3 of the land area of the country. That region matters. I know there aren't a lot of people that live there compared to the south and the north, but we really need to see some policies in rural Wales which will help, and a change of direction of government. So that's what I'm hoping for. We'll see what happens with the results, and then we need a serious discussion about voting reform, because our voting system in Wales does not work. It keeps one party in power endlessly, and we need a single transferable vote, just like the Ireland, so people have the parliament that they voted for.
Yeah. I think you made a very good point in regards of trying to get that people to vote, because otherwise people that want to abolish the Welsh Parliament, they want to erase your identity and who you are, will get in there, because when you don't have your say, someone else is having that say for you. That's why it's so important that we go out and vote in these elections. And now, Jamie, I come to you. What are the next steps from the SNP after these elections?
Well, I mean, at the risk of setting goalposts and then not achieving them, I hope for an SNP majority. It was achieved in 2011. It had that sort of moral weight behind it that was recognised in the rest of the UK, which the Westminster Parliament just uses a flat first past the post system, winner takes all. So I think that would have the moral weight behind it. But then again, a lot of the polls, all the polls suggest there will be a pro-independence majority at the least. So regardless of those two scenarios, I think the next step is for Nicola Sturgeon, if she is returned as First Minister, to request a Section 30 order from Boris Johnson. A Section 30 order is a very technical request. It basically is the Scottish Government asking for a temporary, what would you say? A temporary transfer of, yes,
yeah.
a permission, a temporary transfer of constitutional power from Westminster to the Scottish Parliament to authorise and make gold standard a legal referendum. Now, Boris has said flat out the whole time it's going to be a no, except his actions, really don't speak to that. He formed himself as Minister of the Union when he was elected. He had a union unit, which his job, using taxpayers' money, was to basically fight against the SNP, and that was disbanded after it met, I think, twice. Now he has a union committee. There's leaks and talks about gaming the question, so a 2-part referendum or 3-question referendum. Moving the goalposts to a 60% required majority, holding one straight away. So if the SNP do win big, okay, have your referendum next week. So these don't speak like the actions and the noises of a flat no. However, if Boris and the UK government do decide to go down that route, there are tools in Scotland's disposal. Primarily, it will be a court battle. It will be a head-to-head of electoral mandates, and it will weave its way through the UK court system. It's still legally untested and unclear if the Scottish Government has the legal competence to hold a referendum on independence. Referenda are actually devolved, so we can have a referendum next week on, bin bags or whatever we want. The topic of independence, the Constitution is reserved, but in the UK, referenda have no legal effect. they're merely advisory. So an argument could be made from a legal perspective. All we're doing is what's within our competence in Scotland. So the next few months are going to be really interesting. Nicholas, the First Minister, has been really clear, no referendum before recovery, so certainly not in the next year, I would imagine. But, you know, timescale-wise, if the SNP win a majority, they go through the Section 30 wrangle, we could be seeing a referendum 2023, best case scenario. But it really all just depends. I mean, who knows? It could go all completely wrong, and we could be seeing Willie Rennie, Liberal Democrat leader, as First Minister on his giant deck chair come the weekend.
Well, I really hope not. But I think for for both parties, I wish you both the best. I think whatever the next steps are, it's important that the people from Wales, the people of Scotland, take the decisions and take the decisions for their future. It's not up to Westminster to decide what do we do with our future. It's up to us, and I really hope so that both our parties do very good numbers and that we can achieve freedom for both of our nations. So I would like to thank you all very much for watching today, and especially to Lear and Jamie for this conversation with me. And I hope you all have learned if there's something that you didn't know, and I hope has been informative enough. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.